People often say no one spends 10 years searching for a body. But she would just smile. Because for her, it was never about recovering remains. It was about finishing something that had never been closed. Everyone in the village remembers her, a tiny old woman walking toward the sea on the grayest mornings. Her black wetsuit clung to her narrow shoulders. Her hands, always slightly trembling, held a diving mask. Her back hunched a little, but her steps were steady. If someone asked, she would quietly reply, "He's still out there." Her name was Margaret Tanaka. In 2011, a tsunami struck Sendai Bay. People didn't run from the sea, they ran from the black wall swallowing the horizon. Margaret and her husband, Edward Tanaka, had just enough time to look at each other, a glance shorter than a blink. He pushed her up onto the roof. Then the water took him. 3 months later, the government ended recovery operations in the area. What used to be a neighborhood was now nothing but rotting wood and thick mud. They gave her a bag of ashes with his name on it. But when she looked at it, she knew it wasn't him. And from that day forward, every morning, she walked to the sea. She was 70, so light the wind could tip her sideways. Her back ached, her shoulders stiff. But she read books on diving, practiced breathing through a snorkel, bought a second-hand mask from a little shop near Ishinomaki port. No one taught her how to dive. No one expected a woman like her to ask. But every afternoon, she lowered herself into the cold water tank behind her house, holding her breath a little longer each time. Some days the cold left her numb, her skin pale blue, and still she stayed under just a bit more. Her son Daniel once stood by the door, his voice tight with fear. "Mom, you can't keep risking your life to look for Dad." She didn't answer, just dried her silver hair, folded her wetsuit as if preparing for a journey that was hers alone. She didn't think he was still alive. She wasn't even sure she would ever find anything. But there was one thing she never told anyone. That morning they had argued. Something small, but she had raised her voice. He stayed quiet, stepped out into the yard, and didn't come back. That was their last moment. And from that day on, something inside her remained unfinished. Like a tiny shard wedged deep in the heart, invisible to others, but aching with every breath. Every time she dove, she imagined him somewhere beneath the cold seaweed. She wasn't looking for bones. She was searching for a sentence left unsaid. Maybe I'm sorry, maybe thank you, or maybe just I'm still here. For the first 4 years, she only sat on the rocks. She didn't go into the water, didn't wear the wetsuit. Just sat there every morning for exactly 1 hour, her eyes fixed on the dull gray sea. Her hands held an old pair of binoculars. Her thin wrists were wrapped in a frayed silk scarf. Some said she was confused. Some thought she was silently counting the days until death. But every morning there was a pair of footprints leading to the water's edge, then turning back once the sun had risen. In the 5th year, a man returned from Tokyo. His name was Takeshi Martin, a former rescue diver. He came back to his hometown to open a small diving class for local youth. One early morning, while he was unlocking the shed, Margaret approached her back, slightly bent, a thick notebook in her arms. "I want to learn," she said. He looked up, thinking she was lost. But she didn't explain further. She simply placed the notebook on the wooden table. Inside were handwritten notes in neat faded ink: how to equalize pressure, the anatomy of air tanks, maximum dive times by depth. Not a single line was wasted. Not a single stroke was shaky. He paused, then nodded. She studied in the morning, took notes in the afternoon. Not a single day missed. Some days the water was so cold it left her with earaches for hours, but the next morning she showed up right on time. Her wrists grew weaker. Her steps slowed. But her eyes, they grew brighter. 3 months later, she made her first dive in the shallow bay. That morning, the sea was smooth as glass. She reached a depth of 4 meters. Takeshi stayed by her side, never letting go of the safety rope. When she surfaced, she didn't say a word, just placed her mask back on the rock and let out a long breath. That night, she wrote in her notebook, "Underwater, there are no voices, only the sound of your own heart." From that day on, she dove every week, little by little. 3 meters, then 5, then 7. Once a sudden current nearly knocked her air tank loose. Her shoulder dislocated, badly bruised. The doctor told her to stop. She nodded, but showed up the next morning on time in her old wetsuit with fraying seams. People in the area got used to her presence, that small figure, black wetsuit, silver scarf. No one called her the woman looking for a body anymore. They started calling her the diver widow, and that name traveled across the many coastlines she visited. She never told many stories, but every time she went under, it felt like she carried something that belonged to everyone else, a word left unsaid, a chapter left open. No one planned it, but each morning a few people would quietly stand at a distance, watching her disappear into the sea. Daniel stayed silent for a long time, until one evening he saw her polishing her diving mask by the doorstep. He walked over and said, "Maybe Dad's no longer down there. You know that, right?" She didn't look up. Her voice was light like the wind over water. "I know." "Then why do you keep going?" This time she looked up. Her eyes weren't teary, only full of something deeply real. "Because I never got to say, 'Forgive me.'" Daniel lowered his head, said nothing more. And the next morning, he was the one driving her to the coast. He waited there watching until he saw her air tank break the surface slowly, like an exhale held in for years. That day, she reached her deepest dive, yet nearly 12 meters. Still, there was nothing. But that night, with her hands still damp, she opened her notebook and wrote, "It's silent down there, but not lonely." Day 113 since she began reaching the bottom of the bay. That morning, the sky was thick with gray. There was no wind. The sea was still, but the air felt heavier than usual. Daniel pulled the car up close to the rocky shore. He didn't leave right away. He stood beside his mother, quietly watching her check the tank straps. Her hands moved more slowly, and the skin on her wrists had turned slightly dark from the cold. "Let's just stick to the shallow area today, okay?" Margaret didn't answer. She double-checked the buckles, gave a faint nod, and bent down to pick up her mask. Daniel stepped forward. For the first time, he strapped the tank onto her back himself. Neither of them said a word, but something had changed in the silence, like he had crossed a line from fear to acceptance. She stepped into the water, colder than usual. A thin mist hovered silently above the sea's surface. Below, the greenish light blurred the sand in a fog-like haze. At around 10 meters deep, the current shifted. Sand stirred, visibility vanished. Margaret kept her breathing steady, her hand gripping the anchor rope. But as she moved her left leg, she felt something tug. An old steel cable, rusted broken, had snagged the heel of her fin. She tilted slightly, trying to free herself, but the cable only pulled tighter. Her emergency knife, strapped to her thigh, slipped from her hand, vanishing into the thick silt below. She had 8 minutes of air left. Margaret froze, closed her eyes, focused on her heartbeat. She had 2 choices: wrench the fin free, knowing it would hurt, or wait. But waiting down here wasn't a pause. It was a disappearance. Up on the shore, Daniel looked at his watch. It had been 21 minutes. Every day his mother resurfaced at the 18-minute mark. He ran to the edge of the rocks, shouting. No reply, no bubbles. He threw off his coat and dove in. Daniel had never dived that deep. No safety rope, no tank. But he swam anyway, eyes wide open in the freezing water. Until he saw her, a faint figure curled in the dim sea, leaning to one side. She was pinned by the cable. He didn't think, just dove, both hands pulling hard. The jagged steel sliced his palm, blood bloomed into the water like smoke. When they broke the surface, Margaret was unconscious, her face pale, not breathing. Daniel dragged her to shore. 30 seconds of chest compressions and mouth to mouth. Then finally, a gasp. She coughed up seawater. Her body limp, eyes barely open. Her hand couldn't hold on to anything anymore. I thought this time I wouldn't come back. Her voice was hoarse, faint, like the last breeze before seasons change. Daniel held her against his chest, said nothing. Just held her like he was holding something he almost lost. That night, she didn't speak much. But before bed, she opened her notebook and with slightly slanted handwriting wrote, "The ocean doesn't hate anyone. Just remember, someone is always waiting at the surface." The next morning, Daniel was the one who prepared the dive gear, checked every clasp, adjusted the mask. And when he handed it to her, he whispered, "I'll be waiting here, just like Dad used to." Margaret began diving less often as autumn came. Not because she was tired, but because the aging body has its own way of reminding you it's time to slow down. Her hands took longer to twist the tank valve. Her vision blurred whenever she checked the pressure gauge. Some mornings she stood at the edge of the rocks for a long time, unable to take the step into the water. Daniel didn't ask, but he began double-checking everything. He secretly placed a spare air tank in the car trunk, installed a small camera on her shoulder strap. He never said it out loud, but he was afraid. And he knew his mother didn't have many winters left. One morning she came into the kitchen holding her mask, then stopped halfway across the floor. She set it down gently on the table and sat down in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. The sea breeze drifted through the open window. Somewhere outside, a bird passed by. Daniel saw her eyes soften, not with pain, not with longing, but as if something inside had finally let go. "Are you tired, Mom?" She didn't look at him, only stared out at the pale sky beyond the window. "Not tired, just, I know I can't go any farther." That was the first time in 12 years she didn't go to the sea. A week later, the phone rang in the late afternoon. Daniel answered. A man spoke, his voice deep measured. He said he was from the Miyagi Prefecture rescue team. They were surveying a section of the seafloor that had long been off-limits because of unstable reefs. A minor earthquake had shifted the current and revealed a narrow trench. There, wedged between two dead coral branches, they found a scrap of pale gray fabric. One of the team members recognized it. He had once known Edward Tanaka, had never forgotten that on the day they parted, Edward was wearing a gray shirt. They couldn't be sure. But the man still asked to pass along the news, because they knew she hadn't stopped searching. It had been 12 years. Daniel didn't ask anything more. He hung up, walked into the other room. His mother was folding an old green scarf. When he placed a hand gently on her shoulder, she didn't turn around, just paused mid-breath. And he said softly, Maybe Dad is there." She didn't ask where or who said so. She simply rose, placed the scarf in the drawer, and nodded like someone preparing for a long-postponed goodbye. 3 days later, they were taken by boat to the dive site. The sky was overcast, waves small and slow. 3 members of the rescue team went with them. Margaret wore her old dive suit again, its cuffs now snugger around her wrists. On her oxygen tank, Daniel had written a single word with waterproof ink, "Home." As she prepared to descend, one of the rescue divers stepped toward her hesitant. "Ma'am, you don't have to do this yourself. We can retrieve it for you." She turned to him, voice calm but firm, the kind of voice you don't interrupt. "If it's him, I want to be the first to say I came." She entered the water the same way she always had. The safety rope lowered slowly with her breath. Her flashlight cut through drifting sand clouds. At the bottom of the trench, the beam caught a patch of gray coral. Something was snagged between the rocks, fabric, pale gray. wrinkled slightly, like the edge of a collar buried in salt and thyme. She didn't pull it out, just knelt there, placed her hand gently on the mossy stone. No shaking, no rush. A quiet sob echoed through her mask and disappeared into the water like it was never there. She stayed there nearly 2 minutes. No one approached. No lights shone on her face. When she surfaced, she didn't speak, didn't seem weaker, just exhaled, softly, like someone who had finally released what they'd held far too long. I think I can stop now. Daniel held her hand, not tightly, just held it the way his father once did, wordless, but enough to know they were still together. From that day on, Margaret no longer dove. Her wetsuit was washed, folded, and hung neatly in the storage room. Her diving mask was placed inside a small wooden box, gently covered with a thin white cloth. Each morning she still rose early and drank hot tea just like she had for the past 12 years. But instead of heading for the sea, she sat quietly on the back porch where the horizon was still in view. Her gaze no longer searched for anything. It simply stayed there like a door softly closed, at peace. One day, Daniel asked, "Do you regret it, Mom, not finding Dad fully?" She placed her cup down, fingers gently tracing the rim. No hesitation, no sadness. "I didn't dive to find a body. I dove to keep a promise. And now, I've kept it." Her answer left him speechless. But something inside him eased, light and warm. A month later, someone knocked on their door. It was a woman around 30. Her name was Naomi Clark. Her father had vanished in the same tsunami. 12 years, no sign. She had read Margaret's story in a small local paper. She hadn't come for answers. She came to ask just one thing. "I want to learn how not to give up, but I don't know where to begin." Margaret didn't ask any questions, not about her father, not about why she'd come. She poured Naomi a cup of tea, then led her to the backyard, to the same cold water tank where she had once practiced breathing. The tank was small, old, frigid, but it had never once run dry. "Are you willing," Margaret asked, "to submerge yourself in the water? Even if there's nothing to find?" Naomi nodded, her eyes still unsure, but her posture quiet, like someone ready to begin again from silence. From that day on, she came every week. Then another joined, then 3, then 5. All of them had lost someone to the sea. None asked Margaret to tell her story. None asked about Edward. They simply wanted to sit with her, to step into the cold water, stay submerged for a few quiet minutes, then rise again, wordlessly. Some cried, some closed their eyes for a long time, but each one nodded to her before leaving a thank you that needed no sound. Daniel made a wooden sign and hung it near the gate. Silent Diver's House, a home for those who search in silence. There were no advertisements, no fees, no classes. Just a small porch, a few bamboo chairs, a cold water tank, and an old woman who sat there each morning quietly waiting. Not waiting for anyone in particular, but watching to see who was brave enough to sit beside their pain. She didn't lecture, didn't teach diving skills. Now and then she would simply raise her hand and point toward the horizon, to the place where the waves had once swallowed the city. "That's where I lost many things," she would say, "but it's also where I learned how to breathe again." When Margaret turned 88, Daniel organized a small gathering in their backyard. He printed pages from her old notebook, hung them on the tree branches. The breeze blew gently. The papers swayed in the air. A girl about 10 years old, her mother lost at sea when she was a baby, picked up a sheet and read aloud. "Not everyone returns to the surface. But if you do bring someone with you, someone who once sank." Margaret sat nearby, hands resting on a warm cup of tea. She couldn't recall when she had written those words. But as the page fluttered down into her lap, she smiled, then leaned her head on Daniel's shoulder for the first time in 12 years. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to say thank you. Thank you for letting her finish a journey no one else could begin for her. Thank you because Edward had finally come home, not in ashes, not in cloth, but in the quiet peace that now lived in the heart of the one who had stayed. This is where the story ends. But if you've ever lost someone, ever quietly searched for words left unsaid, then maybe you already understand Margaret. Thank you for listening this far. Leave a comment with the name of your city. I'd love to know how far this quiet truth has traveled.